Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, bemoaning the lack of screen time you got in the documentary about your 1960s band, or else a scrappy upstart, bemoaning the lack of screen time that you got in your band's recent Instagram reel, this is your show, because ultimately it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the last Friday of February 2023, and I thank you for joining us. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made, and it would always be some guy named Dwayne who drove one of those new Dodge Chargers with titanium rims and a Stussy bumper sticker, and who was always trying to sell you Sparks malt liquor before they banned it on the federal level. And old Dwayne would charge you about $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. But it's the future now. You guys, that's not how it works anymore. We're allowed to have nice things now. One of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in: hosting and a custom domain name, and dozens of fully customizable design templates. This year, Bandzoogle would like to congratulate its members on surpassing $100 million in commission-free sales through their websites. The Working Songwriter podcast listeners can go to Bandzoogle.com to try it for free for 30 days. Use the promo code TWS, the initials of our show, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. If you'd like to hear some of my music live in the coming weeks, you can check out my tour page, joepugmusic.com/tour, where there are a bevy of new tour dates posted all around the world, from Seattle to Annapolis, Maryland. Or you can find me the first Sunday night of every month at 9 p.m. Eastern on YouTube for Sunday Songs. That's a live stream. I'm live. I'm playing tunes live. I'm taking questions in the live chat. I'm taking requests in the live chat. It's a really fun, really interactive experience. I dare to say that we're building something of a little community over there. So come on over and be a part of it. It's the first Sunday night of every month at 9 p.m. Eastern. Head on over to joepugmusic.com and click on the live stream tab to set a reminder. Finally, if you enjoy this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, here's a couple things that you could do to help. First, you can become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support creative endeavors that you find meaningful. You just head to their site, Patreon, you search for The Working Songwriter, or you search for my name, and then you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month for the show. Think of it as a voluntary subscription. A subscription that you certainly don't have to pay for, but that you choose to pay for because you dig the show, and because you won't miss a few bucks at the end of the month. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in the price of a cup of coffee every month, it would make an immense difference. So thank you to everybody who's taken the time and the capital to support the show over there. If you're not in a place where you can contribute in that way, it's totally understandable. There's still a couple ways that you could help out for free. First, you could leave us a rating in the iTunes store, or second, you could simply tell a friend about the show. The simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. Okay, I'll end all the harassment there. I hope you enjoy this week's conversation. Our guest this week has been making joyous noise as a musician for about 5 decades now. Robyn Hitchcock hails from England and got his start with the neo-psychedelic band The Soft Boys, whose debut album would be noted as a classic by Rolling Stone, and whose influence would affect REM, The Replacements, and many others. He then went on to have a celebrated solo career in which he's worked with a murderer's row of collaborators such as John Bryan, Grantley Phillips, Gillian Welch, Brendan Benson, The Decemberists, John Paul Jones, Nick Lowe, Peter Buck of REM, Andy Partridge of XTC, and many others. He's recorded for Yep Rock, A&M, Rhino, and Warner Brothers Records. Uncut Magazine calls him a psychedelic maverick. American Songwriter calls his songs fresh and offbeat. Pitchfork describes his music as eccentric, left-of-the-dial pop. I got a chance to catch up with him on the phone a few weeks ago to hear about his journey so far. Mr. Robyn Hitchcock, thank you so much for being a part of the Working Songwriter podcast. You grew up, or you were born at least, in London, and I know your father was a man of letters, but what did music look like in your household growing up? What was the art that you were surrounded by as a kid?
Well, the first records I heard, I guess my father would have bought them, was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley. You know that one? 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, rock, 4 o'clock. Which had a nice coloured sleeve of a kind of clock and some socks doing a little dance. And I think it was Lonnie Donegan, who was a British... When y'all sort of, rock and roll developed in the US, this British variant called skiffle came up, which people like Billy Bragg know quite a lot about. But skiffle was American songs sung by Brits, but often played with like a tea chest and a washboard. And, John Lennon's first group, the Quarrymen, was a skiffle band. So you'd have an acoustic guitar and somebody actually possibly playing literally a tea chest with a broom stuck in it and a one string coming down, and that acted as a kind of acoustic bass, and then a washboard like a guira going sort of, I can't simulate a washboard, but sort of rhythmic clicking sound, like you had a bunch of tap dancing crabs or something. And so we had, rock and roll happened in the States and skiffle happened in Britain. So we had a skiffle record and a rock and roll record.
That's, what I've always wondered about skiffle, did that develop like that because there just weren't, the instruments like drum sets and electric basses ready to go in England at the time? Or did that develop because it was some sort of weird kind of lost in translation across the Atlantic Ocean type deal?
I suspect that, lack of finance had a big part to do with it. It was just like, also the thing with skiffle is you could play it acoustically. I mean, pretty much what you're saying, you didn't have to, that would work acoustically. Whereas if you've got electric guitars, then, and bass, and then you've got a drum kit, then you need some vocal mics. The whole thing is much louder. I mean, actually, if you look at the Beatles, you could probably watch the metamorphosis from the Quarrymen being an acoustic group, and then they managed to buy their electric guitars, and by the time they got to Hamburg, they weren't a skiffle group anymore. They were a British version of a rock and roll group. So yeah, I think that's how it came about.
You mentioned having records of skiffle acts. Were they playing that type of music on the radio as well, or?
Very little. I mean, it was quite hard to access pop music on the radio. There were a couple of things. There was Pick of the Pops. By the time the Beatles came along in 1963, and I was 10, so I was a bit more formed. I heard Bill Haley when I was like 3 or whatever, but it's all a bit hazy. And then I get to 10 and it comes into focus, and the beat groups are up there The Shadows are going, who's our premier instrumental rock and roll act, with a sort of what then became known as sort of surf guitar, twangy guitar. But yeah, it was, that stuff was, you get like about an hour of it on Sunday afternoons, and you get 2 hours on Saturday morning. And then there was a sort of, not exactly pirate station. There was a Radio Luxembourg had pop music that they played in the evenings. So a lot of people tuned into Luxembourg, and they had commercials. But, you know, it was, radio followed rather than led, if that makes any sense.
That does make sense. Although, you know, I'd always imagined it was the other way around, that rock and roll in some ways was almost like a product of the technological revolution of radio, that something was going to be, you know, dispersed into the population in a mass type of way, whether it was rock and roll or something else. But it's funny to hear you say it was the other way around, because you actually experienced it.
Well, from my angle, you know, I was a kid. So if I'd been a teenager in the 50s, I'd know more about it. I mean, the person to talk to is probably Paul McCartney, or a surviving member of the British beat boom. You know, they would have been much more conscious. But from my position as a kid, and I know that the Beatles and the Animals and the Stones and everybody, they got the records they listened to on import, or they came in from American servicemen who had them. You know, so all these 45s of, you know, mostly the black groups, the R&B, an awful lot of that, and a bit of sort of, you know, Elvis and Buddy Holly and that. I don't know how people heard it actually, but there was definitely very little pop radio until the pirate stations came in 1964, because by this time Beatlemania had taken off. I was 10, 11, you know, everybody wanted those records. People wanted not just the Beatles, but the Rolling Stones, and then the Kinks, and then the Who came, you know, people that now are enshrined as classic rock. These were young guys of 21 playing the dodgy British clubs, and the BBC wasn't giving them much pop. So these pirate stations came up in 1964, and the BBC, which was still a very establishment, serene, conservative. They those cats didn't swing, you know. They realized that something was happening and there was a big demand. And in 1967, the pirate stations were outlawed, but the BBC started a completely pop channel, Radio 1. And suddenly you had pop music from 7 in the morning till 12 at night, which was sort of revolutionary. You know, it was all top 30, top 40, whatever. But that wasn't until 1967. So there was a lot of kind of pioneer work.
Yeah.
And it's a good question. I don't know how people knew about it. I guess Luxembourg and the Pirates, but, you know, how did the Beatles get going? It hit the public ear because there was only I think there was a statute for what was called the Light Program, the BBC Light Program, which was where you would hear pop music. Like, you were only meant to have 15 hours needle time a week or something, you know, needle time being playing records. Or I don't know what, you know, there was an awful lot of things like sort of light orchestral music, or people singing rather kind of insipid choral music on Sunday nights, or sing something simple. And you've opened a really interesting, not interesting may not be the word. You've opened a very specific chest there, Joe.
Well, talk to me about that, Chess, because what I'm hearing you describe here, so obviously now we live in an age of not just music, but all media being absolutely ubiquitous, right?
Oh,
And what you're
yeah.
describing is an era where not only was it not ubiquitous, but it was kind of hard to come by. You're talking about, being able to access pop music, what, for, you said 2 hours on a Saturday and an hour on a Sunday.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
how do you think that sort of constricted window that you had to the stuff that was inspiring you, how do you think that affected your artistry in a way that you would have been different if you had come up in a time of more ubiquitous stuff around you?
God, it's hard to tell because I mean the short answer is it made everything more precious and more valuable. I've got to hear Pick of the Pops, Top of the Pops, that when they did the TV version started in 1964. I remember crying because my parents were out on a car journey. We weren't going to make it back in time to see Top of the Pops. I wasn't going to see the Swinging Blue Jeans or whoever it was. But it meant that you valued it. But there was also less of it. Now you can get everything going back to the beginning of recorded music on your phone without even paying for it. You can hear it. You could listen to Bix Beiderbecke or Louis Armstrong or Glenn Miller or the Bobby Fuller Four or Johnny Kidd and the Pirates or the Flying Samosas or whatever they are. And there they are. But in those days, rock and roll had no history. So there wasn't even like an oldies channel. If they weren't playing Chubby Checker anymore, you couldn't hear Chubby Checker on the radio. It took about, it wasn't until rock and roll had been going for about 20 years that people started going, oh, well, hey, they used to be like this, You'd get rock revival, people like Sha Na Na and all that stuff in the early 70s. Elton John writing songs like Crocodile Rock, the movie That'll Be the Day, was the first compilation LP of 1950s hits, which came out in the early 70s. And a company called KTEL managed to get round all the copyright laws because the companies wouldn't dream of being on each other's labels. If you'd recorded for Decca, you couldn't suddenly put something out on EMI. It was completely rigid. I think so. Gradually, this whole sense of the past began to appear. But when I started listening, there really wasn't a past. As soon as it wasn't in the hit parade, you might find the records in a junk shop, or the record shop might keep a copy of something that had been a hit 18 months before, but it was all kind of almost disposable. It just happened and then melted away. And then
That seems like an advantage for creativity to be working in something that you didn't feel like was almost a tradition at the time. That that both because you maybe didn't have to feel like there were rules that you had to follow, and also because you didn't have to worry about if you were ripping somebody off. It was, well, I'm just going to write a song here. If it sounds good, it sounds good, and we'll go forward.
well, that was the 60s, man. We all found parts of the field that nobody had made a mess in. Actually there was lots suddenly there were lots of new things you could do, and a lot of it wasn't very good or only worked because you were stoned or your listeners were stoned. And there were musicians like Frank Zappa who didn't take drugs but assumed that their audience was high. So there was the kind of medicated factor, and a lot of quite mediocre music came out along with really inspired stuff. It was a bit of a lottery, the whole drug world. But that was the point. for a brief time, I suppose there kind of almost weren't any rules at all. But you can't really function without any rules. You've got to have some sort of guidelines, some kind of direction. If there was no sun, what would the plants grow towards? You know, you've sort of you things need some kind of direction. But
Yeah, even if it's simply to rebel against it,
yeah,
there is no rebellion if there's no standard bearer, if there's no orientation whatsoever. There can be no rebellion within that even.
well, that was it. There was plenty to rebel against. I mean, there still is now, I suppose, but maybe more than ever. But yeah, there were all these squares in suits and ties and short hair and, who had to get married before they had sex and wanted everybody to be in the army. And there were all these people who'd been through World War II and then just wondered what the hell these kind of hairy, self-involved layabouts were doing when they'd given their youth and their friends had given their lives. And, my father was crippled in World War II. His leg was smashed. He couldn't bend his leg. I was just always grateful he wasn't an amputee. My dad was actually fairly tolerant, but in fact, he was the one who introduced us to the Beatles. He came in with a radio set in 1963 while my sister and I were watching a science fiction puppet show on black and white TV, and said, "You might like this. I think it's got the Beatles on it." And that was Pick of the Pops. So for a while, the radio and the TV fought each other. And then I think the next week we just watched the TV with the radio, the sound down and the radio on. And the following week we just followed the radio. So he he was quite good at spotting these things, even if they weren't really for him. Bless him. And it was, but yeah, I mean, that's where the generation gap also happened in a way that it hasn't happened since, was the 1960s. And people like me who are survivors of it or came of age will drone on about it endlessly, as you can imagine.
Yeah, it was a different time. So talk to me about, and I am kind of fast forwarding here a little bit, but we got a fair amount to get to. Talk to me about when you first, at least as far as the world is concerned, when you kind of first come on the scene artistically with the Soft Boys. How does that band get formed, and what is your creative role in it?
Well, I started writing songs in 1970 with one of my school friends, and then we left school, high school, boarding school, whatever you want to call it, and we formed a band and played the art school I was at a few times, like 72, 73. And that fell apart, and I went up to Cambridge, and because I had a jam with a guy up there who I thought was good. And I spent 2 or 3 years playing the folk clubs and trying various people out and dragging all my roommates in to get on stage with me. I didn't really know how to find people, but I felt there would be people up there. And around the mid 70s, I began to hear of people who were rated, like, people said, Kimberly Rue, you should meet him. He's a really good guitarist. And another friend of mine said, you should check out Morris Windsor. He's a great drummer. And there were other people, Matthew Seligman and Andy Metcalf kind of flip-flopped in the Soft Boys. It was Matthew, then Andy, then Matthew. But by about 76, by exactly late 1976, I had the bones of what became the Soft Boys. We were called Dennis and the Experts, and then we mutated into the Soft Boys because I'd written the song, The Soft Boys, Give It to the Soft Boys. And that was the first time I had a really good set of players with me. They were all basically happy to be the musicians. I was the front man, the singer. I wrote the songs, I directed it, but the others kind of channeled that into something that made sense. As Morris put it, legitimized my approach. So they were into Steely Dan and the Beach Boys and, a level of musical perfectionism that was generally beyond what a student band could do. I was into Captain Beefheart, which was aggressive and chaotic, but also formalized chaos. Have you heard that stuff?
Trout Mask Replica. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, it sounds like it's just completely at random, a lot of it. But actually, it was all worked out note for note. Even if it was composed at random, they had to work it out. And I saw them play it live, and I was absolutely staggered, because it was.
You saw them play that live?
Yeah. So I saw them playing "My Human Gets Me Blues" and, Pachuco Cadava and stuff like that. And it was very liberating music, because it really wasn't frightened of being dissonant. It didn't feel it had to keep up a 4/4 beat, but it wasn't just stoner rock. It wasn't just like the Grateful Dead sort of intuitively playing their way around each other and seeing if they'd all go to the same place. It wasn't like the Dead was like a sort of shoal of musicians navigating the waters, but the Beefheart was just this kind of inspired bully who found a bunch of young men and starved and intimidated them into transcribing what he played apparently at random on the piano, and if he liked them, he'd give them a piece of toast or something. And then he was mates with Zappa, who was another kind of control freak as far as I can see, and Zappa actually recorded this thing in 48 hours, and then they were all given an extra piece of toast. And then 2 years later, they were on stage in Britain, absolutely devastating, really loud, and playing that stuff as if it was, they were hammering it out like Led Zeppelin. There was nothing tentative about it. It was, oh my God, these random notes crashing into me. Whoa, there's a harmony. Oh God, they're in unison. They must mean it. No, whoops. And then here's the captain going to like that, and the floor shakes, Never said this is typical old man talk, oh, most exciting thing I ever saw in my life, boy. But so, we were like a very mild version of that. I sort of called the shots like Captain Beefheart did, and made up the riffs and things, and then they helped stick it together. To begin with, it's a bit more art rocky, and then it got more straight ahead. But yeah.
As you were working on this at the very start, did you envision this as the start of a career, or was this something that this was just a project that you were working on that you were inspired by and loved?
Well, yes, I did. I mean, I hoped it would last, but you never know how long you don't know how long you or the world is going to last. So, geopolitically, things got pretty dark again. By the Cold War had been off for a bit. It had been tepid and then almost neutral. And 1980, it all came back, and the Russians and the Americans were growling at each other, and the nuclear bases were being replenished in Britain, and a lot of us got really scared. And the British government sort of towed the American line, and we just thought, screw you, bunch of warmongers. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan took power, who were right-wing, regressive sort of. They were regressive, but they were also actually laid the path for a sort of extreme monetization and Trumpism and whatever you've got now, a bunch of basically amoral profiteers who take over the country. So the old right wing, President Eisenhower and Mr. Macmillan and all that lot were sort of replaced by these new rapacious thugs. And, we sensitive liberal types didn't like it. It was scary. So we didn't know how long anything was going to last. I mean, I hoped that what I did would be listened to in the future, if there was a future, because pop, rock, whatever you want to call it, once Bob Dylan got in there, it was no longer disposable. It was clear that if you were good enough, what you did was going to last. So Dylan was the final ingredient for me, in the late 66, 67. And that's what tipped me into deciding that I wanted to be a songwriter. I was good with words, but I didn't understand music, and it took me a long time to figure out how music went. I wasn't intuitively any good, but I fumbled my way towards understanding melody and things. But it was clear that if Dylan could come up with a record like Highway 61 that was obviously brilliant for all time, and you were still going to listen to it 15 years later, maybe what I did or what other people did would still work in the future. So, people are still listening to Talking Heads, and they're still listening to XTC, and they're still listening to the Soft Boys, they're still listening to the Sex Pistols. Some stuff is just sort of irretrievably passé, but it was clear that this was a medium you could work in for life. And hey ho, the Rolling Stones, who are 10 years older than me, they're still on tour. So obviously a whole lot of people are going to go over the waterfall in this decade, quite possibly including myself and the surviving Soft Boys. Matthew Seligman died of COVID in 2020. So already the Soft Boys are that's gone, But I suppose, yeah, there was a sense that what we did, what I did, could last. Yes.
It's interesting. You talked about earlier, you gave the I think you literally used the word disposable for some of the music that was happening at first. People would come up with these pop hits, and then it would just end up in the bargain bin, 2 years later. Now you're talking about a paradigm in which the artists themselves understand that there will be a longer shelf life to this music. How does it change the artist's process when they become aware of that fact, when they become aware that it's not just going to be flavor of the month anymore, that it is going to be something that you might have to stand behind on stage 25 years later?
It should change it. It should raise the bar, and it should make everybody much more careful about what they do. But I don't know if it actually does. I mean, you look at the Rolling Stones, they go out now and everything they play a lot of what they play is actually from before 1970.
Right.
It's all from before 1980. So they're now people who are pushing 80, and they're doing songs that they wrote in their 20s and 30s. Did they know that stuff was built to last? I mean, maybe not, but they seem to be okay to do it.
Right.
I still play old songs that I wrote in the Soft Boys days, sometimes with old Soft Boys. So that's over 40 years. It should make us more careful, but I don't know if we are.
Are you stuck in a rut? Are you tired of listening to that Jimmy Buffett 20th Century Masters CD over and over again and need some new music? Are you sick of making hamburger helper beef stroganoff for dinner every night and you want something new to cook? What you are looking for, my friends, is the Enthusiast Digest. That's my monthly newsletter, which arrives in your inbox the first Sunday morning of every month, bursting with musical recommendations, poetry selections, recipes and cooking techniques for my favorite dishes, and items of general interest culled from the vast cesspool that is the internet. The Enthusiast Digest is free to subscribe to. If you dig the poetry that you hear on this show and the artists that you're hearing from, you'll dig the newsletter because I approach it with the exact same sensibility of curation. Go to joepugmusic.com/newsletter today to sign up for free. That is joepugmusic.com/newsletter. It takes approximately 15 seconds to sign up for a free newsletter that will enrich the first Sunday of your month with a veritable cornucopia of new and delightful recommendations. That's the Enthusiast Digest, the first Sunday of every month. Sign up for free at joepugmusic.com/newsletter. Robyn is the epitome of the artist who remains young at heart even after 5 decades in entertainment. And there's a wonderful poem by Maria Mazziotti Galan that touches on that phenomenon. It's entitled, "My Father Was a Young Man Then." Only 16, when he came from Italy alone, moved into the Riverside neighborhood full of Italians from Salento, all of whom spoke the same dialect, so it was as though they had transported those mountain villages to Patterson. At first, America was terrifying, English, a language they could not master. But my father was a young man, and he became friends with other young people, and they learned how to take buses and trains or to borrow a car, and off they'd go on the weekend to Rye Brook or Coney Island, free from their factory jobs on the weekends, reveling in the strength of their bodies, the laughter and music and the company. My father was a young man then, and even when he died at 92, he never lost the happiness that bubbled up in him, the irrepressible joy of being alive, the love of being with friends. I imagine him in that time before he married my mother, before we were born, before he had a tumor on his spine that would leave him with a limp. Imagine him with a broad smile, his booming laugh, his generous spirit, his sharp intelligence. Imagine him as a young man, his head full of dreams, his love of politics and math, the way he carried those qualities all the way into old age, though his legs failed him, though his body grew trembling and frail, his mind never did. We'd arrive at the house all those years after Mom died. He'd smile at me with real pleasure. The young man he was at 16 would emerge, sit in the room with us, and laugh. I want to talk a little bit about process. In those early days, what did your songwriting process look like? Were you locking yourself in a room and writing song after song after song, or was it more of an inspired thing? What did your process look like early on to get songs written?
I think the process right at the start was that I would write a poem, I'd write a rhyming poem, and then I would pick up the guitar and play almost random chords underneath because I understood so little about music. But I knew the chords, so I'd go, okay, A, E, F sharp, C, and so it was quite clunky, but I suppose maybe it was inventive because I might have stumbled across things that I didn't do later when I realized how melody would go up and down with the chords, and I sort of understood my way. I didn't just think in terms of chords, but in terms of melody. So yeah, it was all right. I gradually began to mix up words and music, having them come out together. That was a big evolutionary step. but an awful lot of it was or became me writing down titles and thinking up titles and then writing them down and then writing the song from there. So it's almost as if the head appears and then the body grows downwards, which I think is a bit kind of, as is the case in utero, actually. The sort of first thing that appears is the cranium and then the spine. We look like little commas, in the womb. So, I was walking down the street in Cambridge and I thought, oh, I could write a song called Where Are the Prawns? So then I did write a song called Where Are the Prawns, and I wrote the words down, and then I took it to the soft boys, and then that got made into a properly arranged thing. I Want to Destroy You. I definitely had that as a title. Kingdom of Love. There was a sort of man who lived in a plastic tent by himself in a field. He'd made this tent himself, and he made all the clothes he wore, and he gargled with disinfectant, and he was not exactly homeless. He was just completely independent. I think there was some elements of his mind that were confused, but there were other elements that knew exactly what he was doing. And he'd go around, he'd knock on the window and somehow I'd give him money or food or whatever. And then he'd do these little blessings. He would, my daughter was 1, and I'd be holding her up, and he'd go, "Oh, bless the baby in the sacred light of life, and the Son of the Father in the spiritual kingdom of love." And he was the guy who had the expression "kingdom of love." So I pinched that from him and wrote the Kingdom of Love song. Probably not the kind of thing he had in mind, but so yeah, Joe, actually, it's my favorite way of writing is to have a title, and then the words grow from there and the music grows with it. If I, and I think I must have evolved that a long time back, probably in the late 70s.
You mentioned that one of the things that you've since learned from early on there is the ability to follow a melody rather than to follow a chord structure. I'm interested in that. That's always been a weak spot for me, is composing melodies. So how did you learn that technique, and how do you now conceptualize composing a melody?
I think a friend of mine, actually, my friend I was at school with, Martin as he was in those days, said to me way back in the early 70s, something about, well, you actually can, tunes can just go up and down from a chord. You can take E and then you can drop down to sort of B and A and that kind of thing. So he alerted me to the idea that a melody could grow out of a chord rather than you had to have a chord and then you threw down the next chord and had to build a bridge between one chord and another. You sort of started with a chord and then you let it drift through related chords. But I don't quite know how I did that, but he suggested it. I mean, so you're playing E major or something, and then you drop down to E major 7th, and then you could go to A, and then you could go to E, and then you could go to B major again, and you could go to A, and there'd be a kind of descent in that. It's a sort of Dylan-esque kind of descent. I mean, you don't necessarily sing those notes, but that chord sequence would give you a way to make notes. It would provide an armature, a series of stepping stones for a tune.
You've had lots of different eras and lots of different musical projects. Who is one of the most inspired songwriters that you've been around and gotten to either work with them or watch them work?
Oh, there's different kinds of people. I mean, the songwriter I've been around with that I've actually been able to work with, to write with, rather, the only person I've really collaborated with in terms of songwriting is Andy Partridge from XTC. I'm I'm not necessarily a fan of all his songs, but I admire the technique he has, and if you put the pair of us together, we can pretty much almost write line for line,
Mm.
called Where Do We Go Next? I'm not quite, I never examined the process too closely, but he's, he, things come to him quickly and they come out of him quickly. And I admire that. Um, there's other people. I really like Nick Lowe's song. Do you know Nick Lowe?
Of course, yeah, yeah.
Well, Nick, and I always think of him as, I think of myself as his psychedelic little brother. I'm 3 or 4 years younger than him, but especially if I've got my glasses on, we look quite alike these days, white-haired dudes with frames. And Nick hones his songs. He really thinks about getting the words right, the sort of wit in the couplets. But he's very old school. He's very aware of not getting too big for your boots. It's very British. He
Mm.
doesn't like to seem like he's, the only egg in the basket, or he's what's at the top of the tree. He's very sort of, he just sort of plays himself down in a way, but at the same time, he's a terrific craftsman, and his songs they've all got a sort of humor and a little bit of sadness to them. We've tried writing together. It doesn't work, but I've played him songs, and he's commented on them, and he's played things to me. I think Nick's really good. I mean, I think both Nick and Andy Partridge are sort of up there.
You mentioned that Andy Partridge, things come quickly and easily to him on the
Yeah.
musical front. Is that the same with you, or is it a little bit more?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, I think that's why I probably couldn't write songs with Nick. Nick's much more of a sort of pencil sharpener, chin stroker. Let's think about this. Andy is just warm, and with me, I love writing songs because it just acts as a release. I just feel a bit more sane if I produce something. It's my reaction to living. It's I draw. Either I draw pictures, or I play music, or I write. Being alive, unfortunately, is not enough for me. I don't know how to live. I can't just sort of exist. I've sort of got to churn something out. And songs are also a puzzle. I don't know if you find that, but you get so far into, you give yourself a couple of lines. Where does it go from here? Or you've got the first two lines and you've got a chorus. How do I link these up? So there's the puzzle in the whole thing, which I like.
The puzzle is the best part. The hardest part is those first two lines, and then the puzzle part. What's fun about that is you know that the puzzle is eventually going to get finished. You don't always know
Yes.
that the first two lines are going to come. But so I don't know. For me, I really have the problem of once the first two lines, once they come to me, I'm like, okay, great, time to go for lunch. Time to take a break and reward myself there. Because the puzzle part of it, that to me is the automatic part of it, and that's the fun.
Oh,
That's the fun part.
I mean, do the first two lines ever occur to you while you're doing something else, like when you're walking around?
They only occur to me when I'm doing something else. They do not occur to me when I'm sitting down to write a song. They only occur to me when I'm
Oh yeah,
walking, when I'm driving, when I'm changing the baby's diaper.
yeah,
Um,
yes.
Now, and I don't know what you find here. One of the problems I've had in the last 6 or 7 years, those lines are only going to appear to me if I'm doing something else, but I can't be consuming other media at the time. I can't be listening to songs in my earbuds. I can't be listening to a podcast. I can't be watching a YouTube video. I have to just be I just have to be operating in life without consuming anything else. And I find myself these days just kind of constantly consuming some kind of media. And therefore, those two lines tend to come to me a little bit less.
Oh, well, then you probably need to cut back on the media you consume. In other words, you probably, yeah, just need to see. I don't listen to podcasts and I don't listen to much music
Mm,
unless I'm drawing. If I'm drawing, then that's the time I'll do that, and I do quite a lot of artwork. But I might put it on if I'm preparing food, but
yeah.
mostly I just don't have other sound on because that way things come to me. Um, Changing the diapers is an interesting thing, or nappies as we call it in Britain. I remember that from my years ago, from my stepson and my daughter in the mid-70s, changing their
Yeah.
underclothes. Things would start to pop into my head, and but I think those first two lines are really sneaky things. I will often realize that I've actually started writing a song, and I'll have to go and grab a piece of paper or sing into the phone, which is the nice thing with technology. You didn't
Yes.
used to be able to do that. But even then, I lose probably 70% of the ideas. I think, God, this is a good one. I'll write this down when I get back. And then the phrasing has gone, or I can't access it like I could have if I'd. They usually
Yes.
hang around for about 10 minutes for me. I don't know what it's like for you.
Yes. Yes. It makes a big difference, though. Technology shouldn't make a difference like this, but it does because when you do have that phone there and you can't open up the voice memo, you can freeze it in amber in that first 10-minute
Yes.
period, and then you can come
Yeah.
back and access it again. Absolutely.
Oh God. Well, that's the thing. Then, of course, you've got to make yourself go back into that amber and
Yeah.
look at it. You can't just sort of, well, you can, but you may find that your phone is full of ideas that you never bothered to work on.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I'd much rather, I don't want to finish songs. I'd much rather open a beer and think about how many good songs I have frozen in amber on my phone. Uh,
well, that's contemplating the possibilities, and that's a really good point because there's something about an unwritten song or an unfinished song, like there is about an idea that is not fully realized, which is it's all potential.
yes,
Once you actually finish it, it no longer has any, it doesn't have potential, it's there.
yes.
Um, it can only be as great as it is. But if you've had the very first bit of it, this could be fabulous. So it there's that lovely point when it's like a sort of first date, or it's like
Yes.
knowing that you're going to have the first date. So this could be absolutely amazing,
Mhm.
rather than just a liaison between two flawed individuals, which will inevitably run aground at some point.
Right.
So yeah, I get
Much rather have this could be amazing rather than this definitely is dog shit. Um,
that. Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose that's what the writing process is partly steering it away from the dog shit. So
yes.
um, I mean, I do feel like an awful lot of songwriting is actually simply picking something up, that just staying tuned to what it is, rather than consciously telling it what to do. I feel like I'm pulling them in from another dimension,
Yes.
I mean, I know it's only my unconscious, and the bit that my cognitive mind can do is censor things as they come through. Say, this is a good idea, that's a bad idea. This doesn't have to rhyme with that. It could rhyme with something else. You don't need to do a chorus here, that kind of stuff. But the raw material of the song itself seems to come from somewhere else. Nick Lowe talks about the man. He says, "Well, I'll just set myself up with the guitar, and then I'll wait for the man to come through."
Yeah.
And Partridge is, I don't know, Partridge just gets these sort of like mental, whenever the solar flares are, things just sort of erupt from the surface of the sun. I think he just gets sort of brainstorms and things come.
But I like the idea of the man. I mean, obviously, that is not even a veiled reference. It's just a reference to a deity, basically. Like the man, the Lord. I think in like English liturgy, you use the idea of the Lord, which is a very kind of like formal. It's a formal way of saying it, right? And so I think it kind of cuts us off from it. But to say the man, or in a Spanish liturgy, I went to a Spanish liturgy once, and they say instead of the Lord, they go El Señor. You know what I mean? And hearing it said like that, El Señor, that makes it it feels more embodied at that point. It feels more understandable. So to hear him say the man, that's what I thought of. You're kind of waiting for the Lord there to drop a good one on you, I guess.
Yes. Well, I think that's what he'd say. I mean, whatever this external agency is, whether it's divine or just another compartment of your consciousness or whatever, you're still at its mercy, I think, and sometimes it's not there.
A lot of times it's not there. But it's been there very, very often and again for you. And very grateful for your work. Very grateful for you stopping by our show to talk about it. And thank you very much. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Robyn Hitchcock's latest album is entitled Shuffle Mania, available everywhere music is sold or streamed. If before we meet again, you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.